Welcome back, I'm Principleasure. We're here at the old Hit Factory Studios in London, going through the mix downs of my debut album, One. This track's called Comply. This was tracked at my own Principleasure Studios in downtown Los Angeles, and the makeup of this track is not too dissimilar to Handwork. In the sense that there's not much going on in terms of track count. Everything was sort of ironed out at the source, if you like. We managed to get most of our sound sources just sounding the way we wanted to, I guess, and in a lot of cases without really overdoing the programming side of things and doing a lot of the filtering and automation by hand in real time. So let's go through this and approach it the opposite way about. We'll start with the drums. I can't tell you that there's anything particularly interesting going on here other than in how I layered the drums. I had a 707 and an 808 kick, and I think a component of a Lin drum LM2 kick as well. Took them all together and took out various portions and added decays and releases just to basically create the perfect composite hits. It's a process that's taken me a few months to get right, but once you tend to know what you're doing with that, you end up with a palette of drum sounds that you can consistently draw from. The snare is very similar to the snare in Handwork. In fact, it might be almost identical, and that's just I think it's a 707 snare with a Nord drum clap and possibly something from the Teenage Engineering OP1 in there as well. The drum track as a whole was bounced into a stereo file, given that it's just a kick and a snare. I wouldn't ordinarily process them together, but I had the fortune of being able to mix this record in some pretty cool studios, and one of the things I absolutely loved using in the hardware domain for as long as I can remember is the Empirical Labs Distressor, and this one had the Brit mode enabled, which I've never actually used the Brit mode mod. I can't remember the exact model number, but it's stereo and it does a bunch of, it's basically more aggressive than the Distressor, which I've got at Principleasure. Put the entire drum track into it in stereo and put a Waves L2, the trusty L2, which has appeared all over the record, over the drum bus with a relatively light amount of processing. Mix that up with an 808 breakbeat, which if I play that in isolation, it shouldn't really work on top of a busy kick and snare pattern, but it does because I've taken out almost all the bottom end in two different points. I've put like a high pass filter and also quite a significant notch around 400 hertz. And what that's done is it's created like a top loop, like a hi-hat and percussion loop, which sits quite nicely with the drums on top. This clap, I believe, came from a Moog Voyager. I think it's one of the presets. Put my hands up and admit that the use of a preset there. But a very cool preset all the same, and it layers, and it's really important when you're trying to do this stuff at source and not do too much processing, just make sure you get the sound absolutely right from the outset, or at least sounding right to your ears. And the clap has quite a lot of processing on it for that specific reason. The first thing we've done is taken it from a mono, moved it to a stereo track, which you'll see here, and essentially turned it from a mono track into a stereo track using this stock Cubase plugin, which is awesome for this. And then the trusty Roomworks reverb over the top of it with a small room setting, about a second of reverb time, mix with the L2 at the very end of the chain. Again, good for limiting and just bringing the overall volume of things up. So yeah, it fits really nicely with the elements that are already in there. In terms of risers and crashes, a lot of this stuff came from the Moog Voyager, and I'll isolate this sound actually. In Handwork, we mentioned the use of the Eventide outboard processors. I've done that again here and printed the reverb I can't remember what this patch was. I think it's called Black Hole. It's one of the presets that comes with the H3000, and it's just such a nice, wide, kind of reverb, delay, chorus effect. And the good thing about having that printed is blending it with the dry signal is much easier to do than if you were relying on knobs, in my opinion. And I use that same reverb on that same channel for the Nord drum splashes, which happen at various points through the track. So let's place those back with drums. There's a bunch of drum fills in here which are coming from a variety of different drum machines. The Lin LM2, the Roland TR707. They were probably just played in by hand, to be honest. Along with the kind of retro claps and the Moog and Nord components, they fit together to build a decent flow through the track. The next element would be the bass from the Jupiter 8. This was, I believe this might have just been Midi at some point, and went through a Jupiter 8 patch, tracked out in stereo, and then put through a distressor with some limiting and some EQ in the low-mid region. What I find with analog sound sources is I don't know what it is, with Roland stuff, you just tend to get this like boominess around 400 hertz, 300 hertz. Or maybe I was just using a really bad room that hadn't compensated for that frequency. But yeah, I always they just tend to muddy things up a little bit in the low mid. So a consistent thread in this track and the other tracks. Also with the specific kick I'm using, which is an amalgam of so many different kick drums with energy in so many different frequencies, I think that the low mids are a very important frequency to not overdo as far as this record goes. So yeah, the bass works nicely with the kick and snare pattern, and the effects work in the top end nicely. I've high pass filtered these, as I had done a number of elements in the previous track, around the sort of 50-60 hertz mark. As is often the case with analog synthesizers, you get a lot of energy in the low end, which isn't necessarily useful. And then we had this, one of my favorite synths actually, the Elca Synthetics, which is super rare, temperamental beast. It's kind of like an Italian Jupiter 8 with not quite as much functionality, but infinitely better sounding in my humble opinion. And we used this in two different ways. We had it as a kind of an intro drone, and it's panning hard left and right, which is probably one of the worst things you can do in any mix, any kind of production. But I just decided to leave it. That's how the sound came out. It's got this weird panning in there, which can't really be controlled. It basically, each time it triggers a voice, it decides to hard pan things left and right if you're in stereo mode. And maybe it was just my particular model, but I decided to put that in there and keep that sort of weirdness. Believe it or not, this was not even affected. It sounded so nice from the outset that I just didn't really need to do anything to it, just get rid of some of the low-end energy. And in this case, because it was a stereo signal that wasn't panning hard left and right, I put the Steinberg stereo enhancer on there with quite a high width. And the LFO tool plugin, which I mentioned before from Xfer, which is kind of like a poor man's sidechain. Sidechaining isn't something I would ordinarily do. I can't really stand that super pumped sound of electronic music from the 90s and late 90s and early 2000s, and I can't really help but make sidechains replicate that sound. So LFO tools is a really nice way of keeping transients out of the way for me without sort of compromising on sound quality. So the Elca just continues to play this string pattern throughout the track and doesn't really do much other than sort of filter out, and I think I played a little bit with the envelope and brought the white noise up. There's a sub oscillator, I believe it's a sub oscillator, it may not be called a sub oscillator, but a third oscillator which I would just bring in and out for various bits. And you can see here from how I've kind of cut the audio that there were various takes in this which were then bounced into sort of 16 bar, 8 bar takes. And yeah, this was, you can sort of see how that's made up the arrangement in the track. Okay, so we've covered the drums, the effects, and the bass line and string part that go throughout the track. The next element would be the SH-101, playing this kind of early hardcore arpeggio type thing. The 101 gets used in so many different ways in my music. I use it almost exclusively as for bass lines, but also for plucks and arpeggios. And one of the best things I did was started using a Midi CV converter there, because with the 101 being monophonic, you don't really, I feel like you just can't get the most out of it until you really start tweaking it in Midi. And real-time filtering is something which I've done throughout this record, and certainly in the case of the 101 sound here, it's all been filtered in real time, and the sub-oscillator is brought up in various points. The decay, release, and sustain settings are tweaked in real time and brought out while the filter's being brought up as well. And we've got this lovely Eventide reverb tail, which is super floaty and probably too big a room for this sound. But again, the beauty of having this printed separately is that you can tweak it to your heart's content. And when it crescendos with the reverb, I would do things like automate the volume up and down. The 101 would have some kind of delay on it in this track, or if it was playing any kind of arpeggio sound, I would have some sort of delay with the delay feedback, the delay time gradually ramped up in the breakdown sections. It's quite a common trick I've used throughout the record. I think I said earlier in another interview that I don't like to overdo opening reverbs and delays in breakdowns. I feel like it's just been slightly overused, but if it works in the context of a track and it's not too cliched, I would occasionally dip in to the sonic toolbox and use that. So let's hear that with the rest of the track. And the only automation that's happening here is that the delay feedback is gradually being ramped up in the breaks, and things are being automated up and down in volume. There's no group tracks in here, but we can switch into the stereo bus and have a quick look at what's happening on the mix bus. Quite similar to Handwerk, slightly different combination of processors, using the Steinberg Multiband Compressor here with the Dance Master setting, with a very, very light amount of gain reduction on each band. Sometimes I would sit and watch these meters, put them on some kind of catch and latch, and just be sure that nothing is being reduced by more than about 5 dB. And the good thing, the beauty of this compressor is that you can like freely move the bands up and down just by using the graph top. I don't think I played with the bands much at all from the Dance Master preset. It just seemed to work for me. After that would come the L2. Quite a lot of gain reduction on this one. Ordinarily I would have this hitting about -3, -6 dB gain reduction. So I would probably pull down the output on the multi-band compressor and just have the threshold sitting around 0.5 dB, 1 dB. And a stereo enhancer. This should actually really be in the middle of the chain. The limiter for me normally comes after everything else. I'd probably put an REQ in here as well. And this had a uniform function throughout the record in the sense that it just kind of acted as a way of just cutting out unwanted frequencies at the very extreme bands, and perhaps adding some brightness around 5 or 6K. And as with the other album tracks, I think for this specific track, there was like a 2-stage mastering. I had my pre-master, which is exactly what you're hearing here. I then went and I think added more limiting and more compression, possibly from Knox, at the very end before sending that on to a mastering engineer to do a bespoke vinyl cut. So yeah, this track essentially went through 3 rounds of mix bus processing. I'm not saying it made it sound any better or worse, but the end result was something I was satisfied with, and if it takes 3 sets of processes to get there, so be it. One of the challenges I had in making a record like this is most of the sound sources were in mono, and that's a huge challenge. When you listen to any electronic music, any music for that matter, from the last sort of 20 years, one of the first things, aside from the volume and the amount of multiband compression employed that hits you, is the depth of the stereo field. So a big challenge for me was trying to get these snares and some of these lead sounds breaking out of that sort of mono mode. I mean, this would have been an incredibly dull record if it had have all existed in mono. Of course, for the purposes of making an arrangement work and having the core kick and bass elements there, mono is fine. But when it came to some of the other sound sources, we had to get a little creative with artificially creating stereo sound sources. The Eventide processors are great for that, because you can feed them a mono signal and have a beautiful stereo feed, a stereo reverb come out, which, as we've mentioned earlier, we printed on there. But for some of the other elements like the snares, the SH101, you've seen that we've used Cubase artificial stereo enhancers, if you like, or techniques to make a stereo track out of a mono track. This can be done quite easily by doubling a track and hard panning it left and right and introducing a very, very small delay between the 2 audio stems. The stereo maker, if you like, in the mono to stereo processor in Cubase, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but it's used almost exclusively on all mono tracks on the record other than the bass sounds. The stereo enhancer is used a lot on the mix bus, various other sound sources, because it's quite subtle, it's not too wide ranging, and I've never had any problems when I've checked my mixes in mono on there. It doesn't tend to introduce too much weird phasing, and I would ordinarily check things or have the mastering engineer check things with some kind of phase meter, phase monitor, to make sure I wasn't overdoing it. You'll see I've used L2 by Waves quite a lot on the album, on the tracks which I've shown at least. I don't really know if it should be where it is in the mix. It's kind of just my go-to thing for just making things sound louder and just sort of limiting the peaks. I mean, it is used as a limiter, but I think an interesting point here is that there should definitely have been compressors used in some instances where I've put an L2. Obviously on the mix chain, it's kind of a de facto thing. It's probably not the best tool out there for the job. For me, it's a force of habit. It's muscle memory. I've been using it for so many years that it just happens to be the thing I put on my mix bus. But for individual tracks, I think, again, this kind of came out of habit. This came out of sound sources being relatively quiet on the way in, particularly from some of the older analog synths, unbalanced gear, and using the L2 as a means of artificially, as a very terrible and scientifically inept way of bringing the volume up on some of those tracks, but also inadvertently limiting them and thereby making them sound as loud, if you like, as some of the digital sources which I was referencing against. This is the intro track to the album. It was the only track that was created not using any hardware synthesizers. Instead, during the course of the album, it took 2 years to make this, I developed my own synth zone, my own soft synth with a bunch of really talented individuals from Midi Tone and Sine Vibes. And what we essentially built was a 2-oscillator soft synth with a parameter sequencer for every possible control on here. So things like the cutoff, the actual wave file being used could be changed on this grid by drawing in data or using presets from these different preset lanes, unipolar and bipolar preset lanes we had. So you could do some really basic stuff like just ramp up the filter and not have to do an automation, but also some really highly technical stuff like changing the waveform on each oscillator at 8 times the speed of the host tempo. You could take steps in and out. You could randomize everything. You could lock the grid and change the preset. We had all sorts of fun building this, and that sound design has come into play quite a lot in the record. So as I was sort of making this album, making this synth, I was also making sounds with it that I thought would work in the context of the record. So intro is a combination really of a 3 zones and a cheap CR8000 drum machine which belongs to Paul Epworth, which was in the church studio where I tracked this. And the use of zoning here is quite basic. I'm just running like an 8-bar loop and just ramping up this automation and relying a lot on the automation that's in the grid. I use this preset called Astral Twerk, which kind of just bubbles along and does its thing and sounds quite nice. But if you look into the grid, you'll see that there's some quite interesting stuff happening here. The sub-oscillator is coming up every sort of 2 steps. The different effects, dry-wet mixes are coming up and down as we sort of graduate through the sequence. And of course, there's a traditional pitch, velocity, and gate sequencer happening where the gate is being dropped out muted out, if you like, on every few steps, and the actual gate of the notes can be changed in there as well. So yeah, it's quite a unique preset in the sense of the constant evolving that's happening in it. And then we have this lead sound that runs over everything, which is super complex. At first sight, you look at this and think, what the hell is going on here? It's a preset called a vinyl warp. And one of the beauties of using zone is that you're not limited by the number of automation lanes. Pretty much every parameter on here can have its own lane and can continue to evolve over these sort of 32-step sequences. In this particular preset, we've got the filter resonance, and I think this was generated completely randomly, by the way. These patterns don't mean anything. I wanted to create a sound where there's so much free-flowing modulation happening that you couldn't possibly recreate this using the automation. And this is evidence in the fact that the filter cutoff follows this completely random pattern at 5/4, where the oscillator modulation amount changes across 2 axes on 32 steps, and the effect sends, in this case, the chorus dry-wet is going up and down, evolving throughout the track. The fine-tuning on both oscillators, and I think that's what kind of gives it that sort of Blade Runner-esque sort of broken oscillator feel. The fact that these two, the fine-tuning on both oscillators is being hammered at to recreate, I suppose, that sense that you've got this oscillator that's unstable and is fluctuating in and out of pitch in real time. And also we added some white noise. We can change this, actually, the circuit noise. We introduced this sort of circuit noise thing where, again, randomly at a 5/4 interval, and you can see if you look at the playhead going between the sequence steps, you can see the speed at which these parameters trigger is different to the speed of the other lanes. This noise level is just crazy because it's kind of like having a noise generator in a working real time in an analog synth, where it's just randomly introducing different levels of crackle. And then finally we've got the unison detune amount, which again, by introducing relatively large values and low values in here, we can replicate the sound of an unstable analog synthesizer. So yeah, that was wholly necessary to create that sound. And yeah, you can see how it sort of comes together. And with the combination of that sort of CR8000, heavily modded CR8000, and some of the 808 snares, which were distorted on the board, we've got this quite unsettling introduction to the record. And lots of different CR8000 percussion. And because of those heavy, thick, soft synth elements, there's not really much happening in the way of processing here. It's a familiar theme, as you've probably established in here. Just some high-pass filtering and some top-end EQ boosts at various points. This album's got quite an interesting story. I was making music for years under a different name, and I just got so bored of what that scene had become, and this constant pressure to sort of commercialize a sound that started out being interesting and exciting and ended out just being noise, really. And I wanted to kind of go back to the roots of what had me interested in electronic music in the first place. I'd always had lots of synthesizers. I'd collected all this equipment over the course of 20 years, and most of it wasn't being used, in all honesty. A lot of what I was doing for the sake of simplicity and travel, etc., was being done in a MacBook Pro, in a laptop with proprietary plugins, which, as you've seen from what I've shown you, is still kind of how I process sound. But I think I wanted to go beyond just having all that gear there and actually pick a combination of devices that would form the backbone of the record. I was listening at the time to a lot of old horror soundtracks and some newer stuff like Johnny Greenwood's soundtracks and what Trent Reznor was doing, and it was really interesting and exciting how these sort of John Carpenter-esque influences were being married with newer sort of noise influenced stuff and using newer production techniques, and in some cases soft synths. And that for me struck a real chord. I wanted to do something that was part soundtrack and part kind of electronic dance floor album. And you know, I didn't rush. I took a really long time to do this, and just before I got here, somebody said something really important, and that was that you should never really rush music making. You shouldn't try and do it under duress. And even though the record took 2.5 years to make, about half of it was written in 3 days, and it just shows you what you can do when you're sort of inspired versus spending a year creating music, which I'd done in the time between my old alias and starting this project. I spent about 1.5 years trying to create and just drawing a blank, you know, call it writer's block, call it what you will, but it just wasn't a very productive phase. And taking that pressure away and getting back into playing instruments, playing synthesizers, tweaking in real time, brought me back to where I wanted to be, I guess. And that for me was the main inspiration for going down this route. Thanks for watching. Check out my album One. You can grab it on Spotify or the vinyl on Bandcamp.